So, it's October, and I should really be doing Victober. I've got 2 Victorian novels I could be reading, East Lynne and Lady Audley's Secret, but I somehow feel I might not get them done in time. I might, yet again, fail Victober. So how about leaning into it? How about getting Victober wrong? Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. So what I thought was that since I'm probably going to get Victober wrong, how about thinking about some other authors? Maybe authors who share the same surname as famous Victorian authors. Now, I knew a couple of authors, Monica Dickens and Joanna Trollope, and I knew that they were related to Charles Dickens and Anthony Trollope, respectively. But for the rest of the authors in this list, I thought initially that I was just picking authors with the same surnames as Victorian authors, but I discovered that another 4 of the authors I've chosen actually have some relations to their Victorian forebears, although some of those relationships are rather convoluted. We start with Charles Dickens, or at least his great-granddaughter, Monica Dickens. Monica Dickens was born into a life of some privilege. She went to the prestigious St Paul's School for Girls in London, and she was even presented at court as a debutante. But in the late 1930s, she decided to leave behind this life of privilege and do some proper work. She'd done some cooking courses so that she felt able to hire herself out as a cook and maid of all works. This did not go well, and she wrote an account of it in her first book, One Pair of Hands, published in 1939. She follows this up in 1940 when she trains as a nurse with a book called One Pair of Feet, and goes on occasionally writing sort of these humorous memoirs as well as proper novels for the next 40 or so years. She's very, very prolific and a very interesting author. We move on to Anthony Trollope and his 5 times great niece, Joanna Trollope. These relationships can be somewhat different, and in fact Joanna Trollope has said that her last name is often more of a hindrance than a help. Joanna Trollope is seen as one of the pioneers of the so-called Arga saga. This is stories of families, well-off families, who are sort of miserable in their own particular way, and sort of dealing with conflicts within these comfortably off people. It perhaps should be noted that only a couple of her novels actually feature the rather over-elaborate and barely functional stove called the Arga. The novel I've chosen to talk about is her second novel, A Village Affair, published in 1980. This is about a young woman who breaks away from her family to have an affair with a young woman who comes into the village. There was an interesting adaptation of this book in the 1990s, which featured a very young Keira Knightley. Our next writer is Wilkie Collins, and I've picked the author Bridget Collins. Now, Bridget Collins started writing YA fiction in the early 2000s and publishing under the name B.R. Collins, and more recently she's gone on to writing more adult novels, some acclaim, adult novels with a slight fantasy bent. Her novel The Binding from 2019 is set in an alternate universe which vaguely resembles Victorian England, and is a world in which books are used to bind strong emotions and strong experiences to allow people to get past them and carry on beyond the trauma. And in this book we have a young man apprenticed as a binder who becomes involved with another rather rich and aristocratic young man who visits to have a trauma removed. Our next author is Arthur Conan Doyle, and I've picked Roddy Doyle to be his modern counterpart. Now, Roddy Doyle was born in Dublin and worked as a teacher until after he published about his 3rd or 4th book. He's possibly best known for his Barrytown trilogy, which is The Commitments, The Snapper and The Van, and I've chosen to highlight the 3rd of these novels, The Van, in which we once again meet the Rabbit family, and Pa Rabbit, who has just been laid off, decides to open up a fish and chip van. Roddy Doyle is definitely on my TBR. We next come to J. Sheridan and Lefanu. I have to say I thought it was going to be cheating a little bit because with this modern counterpart, because Sarah Lefanu isn't even spelt the same way. However, they are actually related, but in a very, very convoluted way. Basically, her 5 times great-grandfather was the brother of J. Sheridan Lefanu's grandfather. So it's one of those relationships which you can just about describe, but it's not sufficiently close for you to define it properly. I think it's something like fourth cousin twice removed, but it's meaningless at this point. Sarah Lefanu is mostly an editor of books. She ran the science fiction and fantasy list for the Woman's Press and worked as a judge on the James Tiptree Award. That award has now been called the Otherwise Award because of the manner of James Tiptree's death. James Tiptree was a pseudonym and her real name was Anne Sheldon. In her book Chinks in the World Machine, Feminism Science Fiction, published in 1988, Sarah Lefanu talks about the tropes of science fiction and fantasy as it pertains to women's writing, and also profiles writers such as Joanna Russ, Ursula K. Le Guin, and James Tiptree. Our next writer is H. Rider Haggard, and his counterpart, William Haggard. A quick thing to say about H. Rider Haggard is that I went to the same school as he did, and my old school was rather proud of H. Rider Haggard, and their little museum display case has this, which is the desk that he carved his name into. So kids, what we learn from this is if you want to vandalise something, make sure that you're going to be a best-selling author, and then they'll forgive you. William Haggard was a pseudonym for English writer Richard Henry Michael Clayton. He chose a pseudonym because his mother's maiden name was Haggard, and she was a distant relation of H. Rider Haggard. I keep finding these relationships. The book I've chosen is Slow Burner from 1958. This is the first of his spy novels to feature the character Colonel Russell from the Security Executive, which is a thinly disguised version of Britain's MI5. Our next author is Elizabeth Gaskell and her counterpart Jane Gaskell. Every so often when I'm doing research like this for one of my lists, I come across somebody who is absolutely fascinating, and Jane Gaskell seems to be one of those. Her first novel was written when she was 14 and published when she was 16. She went on to publish horror and fantasy books throughout the 1950s and 60s, particularly a series of Atlan novels, which is set in Atlantis and in prehistoric, pre-Columbian South America. Jane Gaskell also wrote some social realist novels in the 1960s, one of which was made into a film. She seems to have stopped writing novels in the 1970s and concentrated on journalism, and she later became a professional astrologer. She does seem to have had a rather odd life, but she certainly looks like somebody it'd be worth reading. And quite a lot of her books are well received, but they're very difficult to get hold of. Now, a couple of sources, well, Goodreads and the BFI website, claim that Jane Gaskell is the great-great-niece of Elizabeth Gaskell. But I can't find any more definitive sources than that, and I'm not sure I entirely trust them. Our next Victorian author is Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and I've picked its counterpart, Russell Braddon. Now, the book that I'm going to put up here is The Year of the Angry Rabbit from 1964. I featured this in a short that I did of the Chinese New Year, because this is the Chinese Year of the Rabbit, so I picked 12 books of the Year of the Rabbit. I'm particularly fascinated by this book because it was made into a film called The Night of the Lepus. The film features both Janet Leigh and DeForest Kelley. They changed the setting to from Australia to the United States and made a very po-faced movie. I should point out this is a very po-faced movie about huge rabbits going on the rampage. You know you want to see this movie. The actual novel is a black comedy with quite a lot of satire going to it, talking about sort of the way things are in Australia. Of course, researching this deeper, I found another link. His grandfather was the Premier, the Prime Minister of Tasmania, and was the brother of Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Our next Victorian author is Thomas Hardy, and his counterpart is another Australian, Frank Hardy. Frank Hardy was a committed left-winger and social activist, quite possibly a communist. He has lots of communist links. He's probably best known for his sprawling epic novel Power Without Glory, which is about the life of a Melbourne businessman from the late 1890s right through to the 1950s. This is a fictionalised version of a real powerful businessman in Melbourne, and was made into a rather large miniseries in the 1970s. The book I've picked, though, is The Unlucky Australians from 1968. This is an account of the Gurindji strike, which is a strike of First Nation or Aboriginal Australians against the way that they were being treated. It is really a piece of non-fiction rather than a full-on novel, but it does seem rather interesting. Our last Victorian novelist is R.D. Blackmore, the writer of Lorna Doone, and the person I have picked to go with him is Neil Blackmore. Neil Blackmore does seem to be a rather interesting novelist. He started his career writing in Germany, but has come back to his native Britain and writes some rather interesting looking novels. The novel I've picked here is Radical Love, published this year, and although it's not really my thing, being a gay love story, it is set in and around a molly house in 1809, which is, of course, Regency England, and I always like a book about Regency England, so this could be a very interesting read when I finally get around to reading it. So I hope you've enjoyed my little list of sort of wrong Victober choices. If you want to put together your own list and add the hashtag wrongvictober, then I'll be able to look out for it and find it. Of course, you should continue to read Victorian novels because they're very much worth reading. Enjoy your Victober.